Hello, everyone, and welcome to Disruptive Friday's screening, live every Friday at 5 p.m. Berlin time. We started this series in April as a way to understand and discuss the COVID crisis together with some of our close collaborators from all over the world. We had loads of fruitful conversations so far, and I'm really happy to announce that today we are into our 10th edition. Before we begin, I would like to thank the team of Disruption Network Lab, Jonas Franke and Steph Leng for the production, and Boiling Head for their amazing streaming support. I would also like to invite the audience to feel welcome and join the chat on our website and ask questions to the speakers, or also share relevant links or ideas. At the end of the talk, our team will forward the questions to me. So in this way, you will be able to become a part of the conversation. At this point, I would like to also thank my guests for accepting my invitation and for being here with us today. So I will just shortly say who is with me in the studio. We have Elena B. Stavrevska. She's a political scientist, researcher, and activist. We also have Artan Sadiku, a researcher, theorist, and activist, and Filip Balunovic, a researcher and political scientist. All of them are really more than these small explanations, but then we will go through that throughout our show. Today, we wanted to discuss the way we experience politics and how that has changed rapidly since the beginning of the pandemic. So globally, the pandemic has uncovered many weak spots in our societies, such as the healthcare systems, the care facilities, and solidarity practices. While the governments are purportedly doing everything to protect the population, in public life we also witness growing state intervention, exercise of control, and use of combative language. So what are the effects of this crisis on politics, democracy, gender, and labor? What measures are states taking to combat the pandemic, and how do they affect citizens and human rights and democracy? What does this crisis represent for the resistance, solidarity, and activism? These are really questions that are pretty vast, and the topic is really, really big, but we will be far from ending these dilemmas with our talk today. This is why we wanted to just use these few places of departure to think about the crisis. My guests are coming from the southeastern European region, not easy to define as well, but before we even begin, we all agreed in our preparations that the crisis can be only tackled as a global phenomenon. But still, their respective experiences is always to balance and think the relations between the global and the local, the central and the peripheral. So we will simply use this discussion, the opportunity today to discuss all these overlapping several aspects of the crisis. At this point, I would not like to go on further. I would like to turn to our first speaker today, Artan Sadiku, who, as I said, is a philosopher and activist, very closely familiar with the social and political circumstances in the region. So please, Artan, I would give the floor to you to give an introduction, and then we will expand on it.
Hi, Elena, and hi, others. Thank you for inviting me in the anniversary, let's say, 10th edition of the Disruption Fridays. I think this was one of the very interesting modes of actually disrupting what was going on and disrupting the mainstream narratives of the states on how our days are, especially our Fridays, which previously used to have a different symbolic but also practical meaning. They meant the end of a week and the start of an interesting free time for the weekends. Now, especially after our experiences of the lockdown, all days seem to have the same meaning. And then it was interesting from the very beginning that I saw you name these Disruption Fridays. You took out to play with this symbolics, which is also being lost under the total fragmentation and total assimilation of the practices that we had until now. So, not wasting more time, I would like to speak on with some experiences and cases from the Western Balkans, but also present in other parts of Europe. And I tried to group what happened as a state response to the crisis in two tendencies. And the first is the increased authority and the use of repression by the states, which were manifested practically with imposing of curfews and lockdowns. And the second tendency in which I would like to focus is the failure by the states to handle the crisis because of their limited resources, especially in the health and economic sector. So let me expand a bit on the first tendency. Being caught in this unknown situation, which for which states did not have legislation, did not have previous practice, did not have experience, they were caught in a terrain which was unknown to them. And most of the states, especially those in the Western Balkans, they fell to the inertia of the use of force as the sole legitimate barriers of the monopoly on force. And due to this inertia, suddenly we saw that police forces became as important as doctors in controlling the crisis. This was the first indicator of something that was quite unthinkable, of how states, which did not have, as I said, which do have a lot of resources and funds, suddenly had no idea how to handle the crisis, and they went on with imprisoning the communities and imprisoning us all in our homes. In the Western Balkans, this process of increase of repression and of authority was merged, to bring just some more practicalities of how it was experienced here. This process was merged with a parallel one of concentration of power in the governments, especially in the executive branches. Because through the declaration of the states of emergency, parliaments were basically rendered inactive, and all the government decisions went unchecked. Basically, the governments could decide to enact policies on their often free will without very much without proper processes of expert consultations, without following proper democratic procedures. There was only one case in Kosovo where the Constitutional Court basically overthrew one decision of a government for restricting the freedom of movement. There was only this decision where another democratic institution in the country reacted to this concentration of power under the pretext of urgency by the government. But even with this lack of democratic procedures in decision making during the times of emergency, which now are slowly fading away, curiously, because the numbers of infected people are increasing constantly, and on the other side, we see that these measures are kind of being relaxed. And this gives us a clear example that states, when they are caught in a situation, the first thing that they do, they resort to violence, they resort to police, they resort to repression. Then slowly they see how can they handle the situations in a different way. But in the Eastern Balkans, and especially in North Macedonia, where I spent most of the time, there was another thing that I noticed, a new sort of a tendency that I tried to call in some sort of analysis that I did before, populism from below. Basically, this was an increased demand by people for more state control over the wrongdoing individuals, those who decided to exercise their freedom of movement on their own while it was restricted by the governments. And thus, this was a sort of citizens becoming policemen and acting on behalf of the state. And thus, there was a larger also social force now mobilized on the side of the states, and the effects and impacts of this kind of new tendency, which I would call populism from the below, where people demand more repressive policies from the government, is an occurrence that I think will provide disasters for the future, especially on the groups which want to explore other more autonomous ways of handling the crisis. This was the general kind of grip of power that was experienced in the Western Balkan states. And the second tendency on which I mentioned that I would like to expand a little bit more was the failure of states to deliver protection. Once the state had control over the movement, one would expect that with the resources that they have, they will be more efficient in delivering the healthcare protection and also social and economic protection, which were areas that were also impacted by the crisis. But to the contrary, throughout the Western Balkans, we witnessed a tremendous increase of number of infected people, and especially death cases, and especially in the recent months, this was present in North Macedonia. And this situation, I tried to analyze it, that it was a result of the fact that the crisis of coronavirus came basically after other already existing, but yet undeclared crises were ongoing. The long drag crisis of healthcare and the crisis of labor. On the one side, we had processes of privatizations in the healthcare sector, which had depleted the public sector, and we had also a prolonged crisis of the income of labor. So when the corona crisis hit, there were already these two existing conditions which made the whole situation more drastic in its manifestation and experience. These two cases were enabled, as I said, by the active contribution of state and participation of states in the implementation of various neoliberal agendas. For example, in Albania, in the midst of the crisis, were state assets as state national labs for performing COVID-19 tests. Just this month, this lab was closed down. All the professionals, trained professionals from this lab were left jobless because the state decided to privatize lab testing for all people and all diseases, including COVID-19. So in the time when these professionals were mostly needed, the state left them jobless because they decided to pursue this public-private partnership with a private company. And we see how the state actually, in this case, acted inside the market economy, but to the benefit of capital and to the benefit of private interests of companies. At the same time, as I said, the states did not provide, at least in the Western Balkans, free and accessible testing and protection masks and disinfectants for large parts of the populations, which could not simply afford this due to their deteriorating conditions. Another example, I have to shorten it. Okay. Another example is happening of this sort of state intervention on the one side to control populations through which it increases its own capacity as a general caretaker, but for the restriction of movement. On the other hand, we had recently in North Macedonia, where I'm reading right now, that the state regulatory commission, which decides the prices of energy, decided to increase the prices of electricity at the time when many people have lost their jobs and have decreasing income. And actually today I was supposed to go on a protest and blockades of streets, but I have to participate in this event, so I'll be there next week. So we see another case and a general tendency of states, and I believe Filip will also talk on how states actually in Serbia enabled for workers to be more exposed during the crisis, and Elena also will assess the gender dimension of this crisis. At the end, I want to finish with this. We have states until now that responded there was this general tension between the two modes of response. On the one hand, they responded by restricting the freedom of movement of many people, by incarceration, and by not pursuing democratic procedures in decision making, thus using the force and repressive mechanisms. On the other side, we saw how states intervened in the market, but only to protect the interests of companies and not to enable services and products which were most essential and needed for people who basically were put in a vulnerable situation due to the crisis.
Okay, thank you, Artan, for your really, constructive and very, very, I mean, it's a really big topic, so it's very hard to be short and brief on this. And I think now I'm really thinking of maybe skipping my question and leaving it for later and giving the floor to Elena so we can just gather your positions, and then we leave a little bit more space for discussion. Because what we previously talked about was maybe from, as you, Artan, already mentioned, from, to take the rather feminist perspective and the crisis, and which basically in the corona crisis, the crisis itself has already shown serious consequences on women, non-white minorities, poverty, and sexual diversity. So I would like to ask you, Elena, to maybe expand on this, what you had in mind, and then we will, continue with the discussion in the discussion bit. I think it's much. Yeah.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here among friends, really. I'm going to build a little bit on what Artan was saying of how he was talking about the overpresence of state in some aspects. And I will be talking about the lack of presence of the state in other aspects. So I will be talking about three things that we see from emerging from the crisis, from the COVID crisis, in relation to gender. Because as Elena mentioned at the beginning, I think perhaps one of the most important characteristics of the COVID crisis is that it has a revealing role or a revealing characteristic. It doesn't necessarily create inequalities in and of itself, but it reveals those that are there already. So in that sense, I'd like to briefly talk about the crisis of care, then the gender segregation within the economy or the gendered aspects in the economy that we're seeing emphasized even more by the crisis. And finally, how the current crisis shows even further the type of violence women face. All of this, of course, builds presupposes a society which is patriarchal, like all societies at present are. So briefly about the crisis of care, this is not something that's unique in the Western Balkans. When we talk about crisis of care or the care crisis, we talk about crisis in terms of child care, elderly care, and health care. What is, however, interesting about the Western Balkans, or specifically the post-Yugoslav region as a post-communist region, is the type of welfare system that exists. So the issue of the crisis of care, in a way, is not an issue of, as some would say, especially neoliberals, an issue of culture, of how in some cultures children are expected to take care of the elderly. Many homes are multi-generational homes, and so on and so forth. But specifically, this crisis is an issue of welfare regimes. So why the post-Yugoslav region is interesting is because during the Yugoslav times, it was still a very patriarchal society, so the underlying conditions were not changed. However, the welfare state operated on the assumption of the contract of a working mother, so to say. So women were expected to be in the labor force, but also be mothers and be part of a nuclear family, so to say. What happened in the aftermath of Yugoslavia is not just the shrinking of the welfare state, but also in all sorts of austerity measures that we've seen throughout all sorts of IMF and World Bank interventions, and one reform after another. But what is important here is the assumption on which all of these measures are based, and that is the limitless capacity of women, usually women, to provide free and unpaid labor inside the home. Basically, if we remove this service, the assumption is if we remove this service from the public, there will be someone in the home who will be able to provide that, right? So all of this has led to all sorts of constraints and all sorts of further gender inequalities in the region, and increase of this unpaid labor inside the home. Now, of course, it comes as no surprise to anyone who has paid attention to this, that with the closing of nurseries, the closing of schools, and with the removal of the elderly from the childcare domain, because they have to shelter, given the virus, them being more vulnerable to the virus, it is absolutely not surprising that several studies that have been done in the past 6 months show that women report significantly higher increase in unpaid both domestic and child care labor, but also elderly care labor in some cases, to say nothing of the homeschooling that needs to be provided. All of this comes on top of the fact that this care crisis that I'm talking about happens at the periphery. So in terms of care chains, and we can talk more about this later, what that means, but care chains that people from the periphery of societies from the periphery provide for the core, this has increased even further. So we see from Romania and Bulgaria care workers coming in special trains to Austria and Germany and so on, to provide those working in the care industry to provide further care labor. So it has emphasized these intersecting inequalities that it's not only about gender, but it's also about class, about regional discrepancies, and so on and so forth. The second thing, the second revealing role of the COVID crisis I want to talk about is the gendered segregation within the economy. So we have seen when I say gender segregation, it refers to sectors and parts of the economy where a certain gender is more likely, or a certain gender is overrepresented. So we have seen that some of the industries, Artan mentioned this as well, some of the industries have been considered by and far expendable. So in the fight between labor and capital had been prioritized. But in addition to that, we have to see what are the sectors that have been considered expendable in many ways. And when I say expendable, I mean people have been asked to remain at work or go back to work without any protocols being put in place. So we have seen this with textile workers in Macedonia, for instance, where by and large it's women being employed, where there were no protective measures. And of course, that was one of the clusters that was created in the country, or North Macedonia, sorry. The other aspect is that when I say that the economy is gendered, it also means that there are certain sectors where men predominantly had been employed, such as manual labor, who have lost their jobs. So this shifts the relations inside the household as well. So a UN Women study in the region recently found that more women than men had switched to home-based working, but more men had lost their jobs. What this means in terms of the relations inside the household is that some women might have become breadwinners, have become breadwinners, which leads to a shift. And this leads me to the third point, but before that, one more point is that a lot of women in the region, and not only in the region, this is a phenomenon happening all over the global south as well, are employed in the informal economy. With their inability during curfews and lockdowns to move around, that means that they have also no access to what is essentially their market, what is their workplace, what is their access to income in any form of way. So finally, when I said that more women had switched to home-based working, and with the curfews and the lockdown, we all have spent more time at home. This, the whole idea of stay at home presupposes a safe home. However, we know, because study after study, not just in the region, this is a global phenomenon too, reveals that the home is not a safe place for a lot of women. So in that sense, we have also seen higher reporting of domestic violence across the region. I want to take 30 seconds to explain this. So this does not, domestic violence has obviously increased, but reporting as well has increased. So in the past, we haven't always had the exact figures of domestic violence because of the power relations inside the household. A lot of violence remains unreported. So for this reporting to go up, it also means that the severity of the violence has increased. So to kind of conclude, here is the crisis, as I said, is revealing in and of itself. And if anything, it's not creating new inequalities. However, it is increasing existing inequalities. Those be inequalities on the basis of gender, on the basis of class, on the basis of race, the intersecting inequalities. And we will see this, the poor becoming poorer, the rich becoming richer at an even more, faster pace in the period ahead.
Thank you, Elena. We have, we are changing a little bit the scenario. I would like to give the floor maybe to Philip, and then so we have a little bit more space than when we start discussing, because all these aspects are important, I think, to get into discussion. Because when we were coordinating this talk, we were talking with Philip, who had a study in the beginning of the crisis about an analysis of the abuse and exploitation of the factory workers in Serbia. And the labor rights on the periphery. So basically, to make the circle full, I would like to ask Philip to maybe share his views on these relations, and then maybe to open the floor among the three of you, considering all these aspects, because this has also been like a recurring moment in the crisis on a global level. But yeah, Filip has a bit more insight from particular examples in Serbia. So go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Elena. So I'll be talking about further violation of labor rights in the time of pandemic in a country which belongs to the European periphery. And this could be, or can be actually, taken as common for most of the countries on the European periphery, let alone the countries on the world periphery and continents such as Africa. But what has been so evident from this crisis is the role of the state, which is playing the role of supporters and policymakers, a policymaker for the sake of the richest and for the sake of those who own the factories. So I wrote an article focusing on industrial workers who were under threat in two ways when the epidemic in Serbia started. On the one hand, there has been reported several hundreds of layoffs. But the truth is that there have been much more layoffs than what was reported, especially in one British company, in one French company, but also in the notorious South Korean company called Jura. So one threat under which the industrial labor found itself was the threat of layoffs. The second threat that the workers found themselves under was the threat of being further on exploited and put into danger from being infected. The reason behind this is that there were some recommendations and indeed some obligatory policies coming from the state, which were not taken into account by the private companies, usually of foreign ownership, who were forcing people to come to work in spite of those recommendations and indeed regulations. This is not the first time that things like that happen with respect to violation of workers' rights. In this case, this was a violation of their fundamental right, and that is the right to life. And it was also the violation of something we could call public health, which proved to be important and existing. As a matter of fact, as Boris Johnson said famously, there is such thing as society. We realize that now in the time of epidemic. So specifically in the South Korean factory called Jura, which has several branches in southern Serbia, in the cities such as Leskovac and Niš, they were actually forcing people to come to work even after they learned that from the factory was infected. So they were forcing them to come to work, but they couldn't secure the safe distance, for instance, for workers who were working inside the factory, and they couldn't secure all the precaution measures for the workers who were, for instance, coming by buses to work, because the foreign companies usually function like that. They focus on a regional center, such as in South Serbia, the city of Niš, or in autonomous region of Vojvodina, the city of Novi Sad, and then they employ workers who are coming from the entire region. And when workers are coming from an entire region, they're forced to travel every day by buses, and no one could make those workers safe, not only on their working place, but also during the transport. So on the buses, they could never be physically distanced from themselves. To the contrary, they were packed, and we have numerous testimonies by workers saying that in the first so-called peak of the pandemic, no regulations were respected. Now, this is here we come to the role of the state, which is something that Artan touched upon in his speech, which is, in my view, existing. So we can talk about the role of the state. So the concept of the minimal state is not the concept of the state which is absent. The state is super present, but in a wrong way. The presence of the state can be measured also by on the one hand by acting, and on the other hand by non-acting. So this is also the measurement of how the state behaves. So we're talking about the behavior of the state, which is doing nothing to prevent not only the foreign investors to exploit and endanger the health of the workers, but also doesn't play an active role in preventing what is considered or securing what is considered to be public health. But as I said at the beginning, the epidemic showed only the extreme version of this non-act or the absence of action by the state. Before that, we had the example with the same factory, for instance, Jura, where some independent media were reporting that workers were forced, for instance, or were told that not to leave their workplace, not even for the bathroom. And then when they started complaining, the reply from the management was that they could wear diapers. And this was reported by, at first, independent media, afterwards even the mainstream media. And the answer from the top of the state of Serbia was that the reporting didn't do well to the relationship between the state and the foreign investor, that the workers should have left the state to deal with this issue behind the closed doors. So they recommended openly not to go to talk about the maltreatment of workers in public. This phenomenon that had been happening before the pandemic took a larger scale during the pandemic. And when we ask finally the question whether we are talking only about the very dangerous position of the industrial workers, which doesn't replicate to other sectors and other workers, the answer is it does replicate, because the boomerang effect from the maltreatment of industrial workers goes to the medical workers, which again were number one overwhelmed by a high number of cases of infected people, due to all the things that Artan was also talking about, the mismanagement and the conscious financial cuts in the sector of healthcare. Finally, this is it. I will stop here.
Thank you, Philip. It's also, really great insight that you are giving also with that paper. Something that, this is from the beginning of the crisis, basically, as we were also talking in the preparation of this talk, we have the same kind of attempts of different countries with different levels and different economies of not really being prepared to deal with the crisis, and a lot of denial and a lot of misinformation, whether it's from the very beginning of kind of hiding data about the existence of the virus, and then to the end with the mistreatment, and especially with the low skilled or lowly protected workers. Because what you are talking about, the factories in Serbia, what we know about the factories in North Macedonia, sorry. Also, there was you also know about the scandal in Germany with the meat factories, which was one of the biggest and massive outbreaks. So this really brings us to also, when we compare really different levels, really different economies and circumstances. But sometimes when we talk about the vulnerable groups of workers, also flying in workers to compensate for the lack of labor force in Western Europe, we are facing these very complex conditions. So I would like to now maybe have one joint question to all of you before we also expand to questions from the audience. And I don't really know, I mean, it will be one question to each of you because I don't want to wrap it up only in one. But Artan, or if you want, you can discuss it also together. But Artan, one question to you would be, I mean, we have discussed this quite a lot, and the measures. And on one hand, I completely agree that the measures were super strong, but I also see this discrepancy between the way, let's say the case of Northern Macedonia, where the crisis was very decently managed, but there was like a big discrepancy of how the undemocratically it was treated and communicated with the citizens. So I'm really thinking what should be, or if you have, like to discuss shortly, what should be the balance between these approaches, because on one hand you really have this basically well managed, decently managed, let's say, health crisis with really bad inclusion of the citizens. I don't know whether you would like to briefly,
I think that this balance is always a result of a certain situation between a certain result of power struggle, actually. And in this case, with the imposing of lockdowns and curfews, you had the cancellation of the side of the citizens, of the side of the communities, to have their voice, to have their say, and probably, which is very important, to practice other alternative ways of mutual help, of alternative economy organizing in their communities, because the state wanted to keep the monopoly on the whole spheres of practical life in the country. So there was no chance for reaching or achieving a sort of a balance. And here I see now some sort of movement which is brewing and organizing slowly, which is around the increasing prices of electricity at times when states like France and Spain have lowered intentionally with state subsidies the price for electricity for their citizens. We see here the contrary. The prices for electricity are increasing because of the continued interest of capital in the country. And here we come to the very interesting point that was made by Elena at the beginning, in the first sentence of her talk. She said the revealing aspect of this crisis is very important. And that is an aspect that brings us to the verge of the things that we already knew, but now they're manifested in different and unfortunately more harmful and vulnerable ways. So the question to me, which is relevant now, is one of also balance in the discourses. When you ask balance, it's not only because the balance in real power also goes hand in hand with what kind of balance we do have in the public discourse. And the question now is, since this crisis has revealed a lot of inequalities, when labor has to go to work and women and caretakers have to be exposed or lost their incomes, which discourse will prevail? Will it be the one that, since this crisis has been revealing, we have to once and for all tackle seriously the issues of labor, of gender and class? Or will there be a prevailing discourse of a general sacrifice that we all have to make now, that in order to overcome the crisis, especially now in the upcoming crisis, in the upcoming economic crisis, and then sacrificing this at times when we see that the richest people make tremendous amounts of income and money and profits day by day, exactly because of this crisis. So the question of balance to me is also the question of discursive fight, and how will this revealing be translated in political terms further, not only of formal politics, but also of social and autonomous groups, and how much will they be able to maintain their practices without being countered by the state?
Thank you. I will kind of continue, or I don't know if any of you has something to reflect on, Elena or Philip, on Artan's position.
No, I mean, I agree with Artan with everything that he said. The only thing, because I spent the lockdown in the UK, where I'm currently based, where a lot of it was, so the state withdrew, it announced a lockdown, and then it presupposed societal or individual responsibility, which in my understanding of things, it's a very neoliberal approach to responsibility. So you individualize the responsibility and you just leave it to the citizens. So I think it's also sometimes a balance. I mean, Philip put it well when he said that it is a matter of where the state, of course, is present. It's a matter of where they decide to intervene and where they don't. Where do they draw the line between balancing aspects that are communal, aspects that are democratic, and also taking responsibility for the citizens rather than just rather than just expecting this individualized responsibility to take care of take care of a societal problem. That was the only thing that I want. I mean, everything else I agree with what Artan said.
Okay, maybe, I don't know, I have a question for you, but it's, you could be very brief because it's a very big question, but there are different initiatives that are happening globally, and I know that you have insight into much wider area than just the one we were talking about. And there are also, attempts for feminizing politics and, having included much more all these aspects of care. So what is your insight and what is your opinion? How does that work? Because there are, globally a lot of initiatives at the moment, and a lot of things are being opened with the crisis somehow for thinking at least.
Yeah, I mean,
I know it's a very,
It is, it is. We can be here for hours, but briefly, basically, to build on what Artan was already saying, it is about the understanding of vulnerabilities, and it's when I say that this is the COVID crisis has gender revealing role as well, or gender revealing characteristic as well. I don't mean to say this, it only shows us how women are affected. It means how gender plays a role in a lot of in the way the society is organized, the way society function anyway. So this is just all those inequalities on steroids, basically. So I think in the months ahead, and this has already started, and of course it has started from the grassroots, as most progressive ideas have. We need to focus on building solidarities and finding what are these intergenerational, inter-identity, intergenders, and so on, solidarities on which we can build and how we can connect the movements. I think that there is a tendency, especially in the global north, to treat some things as very unique to the country, but we see also ever more the importance of connecting the what's happening in the global north with what's happening in the global south, and this is where the care chain I mentioned earlier comes into play, where we see domestic workers, or women usually, but not only women from the global south. Here I include the global east as well, for lack of a better word, for whatever the Western Balkans is in global terms, where women do go to the global north to primarily take on care roles, whether they are care roles in the healthcare itself or domestic care. My point is that we need to understand these global care chains as well if we are to address the crisis of care that is happening globally in a way that is progressive, in a way that's emancipatory, in a way that's just at the end of the day.
Thank you.
I can go on if you want.
To such a vague question. I'll just go briefly to Philip before we move to the questions from also our audience. Philip, I will just combine a few things that I had in mind to ask you, but due to the time, I would like to refer to also like a case-specific situation that the situation that happened in Serbia recently this summer, due to the misinformation of how the government was basically dealing with the numbers of the COVID cases, but not necessarily to talk about that, because something that we could also refer to, and it's also in one of the questions already addressed to you, is do you see like is that some potential for also to encourage more like civic participation and to make pressure to protect workers' rights? And do you have examples, for example, of counteractions coming from the workers themselves? These protests were mostly like civic protests, not necessarily, I guess, happening in the factories, but do you maybe have more information of whether there was organizing of this sort due to the measures also among the workers themselves? Philip, we can't hear you.
Sorry. There was some resistance, and especially in the earlier mentioned factory of Jura, where the workers refused to enter the factory before all the measures were secured for them. But then I remember one of the workers was giving an interview, a short interview, to the one of the rare independent media television stations, and while he was giving an interview, he was arrested and under accusation that he was violent and whatnot. Also, a journalist who was reporting on the lack of equipment in the hospital in Novi Sad, which is the regional center of the autonomous region of Vojvodina. She was reporting about the lack of the equipment, and she was arrested the following day. So she spent the night in jail. It turned out that actually the government said that actually the equipment was stored, so that they had it somewhere in the basement. But yeah, I don't believe. I mean, I think I do have right to say, as a social movement scholar, that social movements and these pressures from the civil sector from below cannot do much, especially not in the time of crisis. I think that more than ever in the time of epidemic, we need a more serious political organization. So the civil initiatives, protests, petitions, even if they come from, I don't know, the trade union of the medical workers or the trade unions or organized labor, especially in the countries on the periphery, cannot do much if they are not supported by an organized and well-structured political force. And unfortunately, in our region, in countries such as Serbia or Macedonia, I still do not see that political actor who could, why not, I mean, benefit from this crisis. And the left historically has been trying to benefit on the crisis of capitalism. And this is one of such crises, even though not a typical one like we had in 2008 or before. But I think that an additional obstacle in countries like Serbia with authoritarian condition already, not even tendencies anymore, is that the single party, Artan was talking about discourse, has prevailed in terms of rule over meaning. So whatever happens in the public space in this way or another gets shaped dominantly shaped discursively by the ruling party. And finally, what I wanted to say, we were talking about society and state and the harsh measures that the state was. Elena was saying that in Britain the state was putting everything onto individuals, so you should take care of yourself. But I think that the main problem of our societies is that societies as such had been disintegrated before the crisis started. So the state, in order to secure the the minimum of functioning and to avoid the humanitarian disaster, had to, in some cases, rely on its repressive apparatus, precisely because the societies had been destroyed by the same states beforehand. So the sense of solidarity, the sense of integration of society, of mutual dependence among different social groups and individuals, is not something that individuals and groups within our societies were aware of. So fragmented societies cannot do much, and fragmented societies are suitable for applying repressive measures because they can easily be justifiable.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. Yeah, I will restrain from my comments because we are running out of time. I had some other questions in my sleeve, but yeah, I think I will just take a few questions from the audience. One question each of you gets one question, and then we see how we go. One question to Artan. It is the responsibility of all of us working with art and culture to keep providing occasions of critical thinking. How are you dealing with the situation of lack of cultural events in your country, being active within the Creek Festival, for example?
One important aspect is in all that discursive fight, and also not only with that, in providing alternative ways to the ones that the state has been providing, that the state has been pushing for, is through enacting critical culture discourses and critical culture practices. But unfortunately, most of these examples that we have seen, not only in the region but also around the world, has been in finding this kind of, I would say, in brackets, creative ways of how to maintain some cultural events in the times of crisis, and when indeed you had to be creative of how to tackle the things that have been revealed by crisis in a new way, to how to bring them up and make them more revealing, make them a part of the political discourse, so that the focus would bring to them, so that the focus will go to these questions. And then there is these two sort of creativities: one, how to do the same old things, but with these new practices, and then there's this sort of releasement of measures for cultural activities. And with the Creek Festival, we have tried to refocus and reorient the whole content towards addressing the consequences of the crisis and towards looking for possibilities how to use, because Philip said that we need an organized political party. I don't believe in political parties myself. So we try to see how to organize communities in being more resilient and being more autonomous to the interests and to the interests of the capital and behaviors of the state, which we have seen, as we have witnessed until now, are quite unpredictable in their decision, but very predictable in their intentions, to protect the interests of the capital. So I see there the major contribution that the critical culture organizations, groups, and movements can provide in this case is to even bring even more the revealed aspects of this crisis, and then try to make these aspects more political. And not only in the formal sense, but more political also in the social sense, in the sense of mobilizing more people around these aspects.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're all in the same bucket here, trying to do what we can and adapt as much as we can. So in order to continue doing what we are doing. The very idea of this edition that we also started to begin with. I have one question for Elena. I will have to choose only one from each, unfortunately. It seems that we will all need to coexist with special measures in the months to come. So the question goes to you, which citizen participation or grassroots initiatives do we need to encourage to provide common good beyond the intervention of the states? I think goes more in the direction of
existing
solidarity.
or in general terms?
I think it's citizen participation or grassroots initiatives that probably already exist.
So there have been already
worth encouraging in order to
So there have been already grassroots initiatives across the region, here in my neighborhood in London, where citizens get organized trying to help, more vulnerable population, bringing them groceries and so on. But this in and of itself is not enough, I think. And I agree here with Filip when he said that it has to come in a political. Well, he said in terms of a political actor, but I do think we have to push for policies, especially as we're facing recession in the months and years ahead. We have to push for policies that do include the most vulnerable, that do take the most vulnerable into account, that doesn't treat also the most vulnerable and as only victims of sorts, but as people who have their own agency as well. So I think that the most that can happen, not the most, in the current system, in a representational democracy, and we're all representational democracies of sorts, to a certain extent in the Western Balkans, we have to push for policies that are mindful of this. We don't have too many mechanisms to do this, other than protests, other than calling our representatives and organizing with the political forces that are there in existence. But again, as Filip said, there aren't too many who are on the side of the spectrum that would take this forward. I would also, I don't know whether this question comes from the region or from someone maybe positioned in the global north. But I do think that here the EU has also a role to play, because some of the policies that are being developed currently in the region are dictated by the EU. So, of course, while the EU itself, we can debate how the countries within the Union have responded. In terms of the weight that the Union carries in the region, I think some sort of pressure for more equitable policies can be applied from there as well. Although this is a super, super hopeful idea, which is never going to happen. But there you go. It's Friday.
It's Friday. Let's go crazy. Thank you, Elena. And one last question for Filip. I will have to shortly wrap it up. But I want to ask this as well. Does the state have significant influence on policies for employees of foreign companies or just for domestic companies? So how are these workers, do they have any kind of protection from the state?
I don't think there is a difference between while I was talking about the foreign companies, I didn't intend to make a crucial difference between domestic capital and foreign capital. It's just that these cases of mistreatment of workers was more tangible and more visible, more obvious in those bigger companies, which are usually owned by foreign owners. But the state only takes care of the investors. So the state takes care of subsidizing the investors to launch their production in Serbia. They subsidize the employment of some people. They do not impose any regulation whatsoever about layoffs. So we had numerous cases from Zastava, so the car factory, to other privatized factories, that number of employers was cut by 2/3, three-quarters, and so on. So the state does not recognize this as a relevant social, economic, and let alone political problem. So we have there is a party in Serbia called Socialist Party, which has never ever, since its foundation in the 1990s, addressed this issue, especially not after 2000, since when this party has been more or less in the ruling majority always. So yes, the workers are left alone, together with just like other people who are on the margins of the social. Whether we are talking about workers, women, female workers, minorities of a different sort. They are all left alone, with some activist groups who are trying to show some solidarity with their neighbors who are still maybe bringing them food if they are put into quarantine. But I don't think this is enough for any tangible and more radical change. I think that we can criticize the state, we can criticize the very concept even, but what we need is to take over the state in order to change things. I don't see any other, especially again coming back to the condition in Serbia. There is no whatever you do. So Serbia is different now. I'm in Croatia, and in here politics is usually trying to hide things. So they are if you dig up something they did wrong, they are not ashamed, but they're trying to either negate it or trying to make some concessions and so on. In Serbia, there is no such thing. Everything is on the surface. Everything is visible. Shame is a non-existent category in the public space. So you can say